In 2009, researchers identified evidence of possible West African spiritual practices in the greenhouse at the White House Plantation, where Frederick Douglass was enslaved as a child. There are two caches, groupings of spiritually charged objects that attempt to control the supernatural world. The first, a bundle buried outside the doorway to the slave quarter, and the second, a pestle placed in the brick furnace of the hypercost structure that heated the greenhouse. This bundle included a colorless quartz projectile point, a chert projectile point, and a coin. These objects were placed deliberately to direct spirits away from the entrance. It is particularly of importance that the doorway to the greenhouse slave quarter faces the Lloyd family cemetery, which places the bundle in between the living area of the home and the spirits of the dead. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, describes the intense aversion of the slaves to this burying ground and the unease that surrounds the area of the plantation, saying, quote, "Superstition was rife amongst the slaves about this family burying ground. Strange sights had been seen there by some of the older slaves. Shrouded ghosts, riding on great black horses, have been seen to enter. Balls of fire have been seen to fly there at midnight, and horrid sounds have been repeatedly heard." End quote. While conducting oral history interviews on present-day African Americans in their gardens, Greg Undercook took note of found objects that serve to denote the entrances to yards. Separation of spaces between exterior and interior is important and creates a transition between two worlds that necessitates protection. In addition, the pestle in the furnace was placed in the keystone position of the brick furnace by one of the enslaved workers who built and maintained the hypocaust, which is a system of flues that carries warm air throughout the structure. In one interpretation, this pestle could indicate an object calling on Ogun, a West African deity associated with iron, fire, and heat, and who can be found in many African diasporic and syncretic contexts. He simultaneously embodies two notions of masculinity: the violent warrior who can harm or kill an opponent, and the benevolent father figure who can nurture, protect, and seek justice. These objects of protection and power demonstrate that as the greenhouse and the plantation landscape as a whole symbolized control over the natural, the hidden landscape within it held control of the spiritual. From this perspective, the greenhouse becomes not just a place for the ordering and control of plants, but also a space for healing and protection. The iron farming implements used by the gardeners and field laborers also takes on a different meaning. In certain West African religions, such as Yoruba, Ogun is associated with the iron in the forge, and particularly the iron of weapons in farming and smelting tools. The combined importance of particular plants and iron for West African religions brings the structure into an entirely new light. I was at the Louvre in Paris a week ago and happened upon the statue here. We redesigned this slide, and I think it works really well looking at sort of the relational aspect of the shapes of the plants and the shape of the iron objects that are being called on here. So while the analysis of pollen taken from the Y greenhouse and attached slave quarter is still in its preliminary stages, there's evidence to suggest that the landscape, either in the greenhouse or its surrounding lands, was home to flora with significant morphologies. For example, through his ethnographic research in Brazil, Volks found that the long blade or spear-like leaves associated with the aggressive and warring gods, such as Ogun, are associated with the hunt and warfare. The remains of the plant Sagittaria, which was found in significant quantities in the greenhouse slave quarter in the 18th and 19th century context, but not in the greenhouse proper or in modern samples, is known colloquially as arrowhead for the shape of its broad-like leaves. Additionally, river pebbles are another type of physical object that embody Ase, the metaphysical control over the spiritual world, and are associated with the river goddess Oya. In many West African cosmologies, bodies of water and their surfaces act as the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Formal gardens and plantations frequently bordered or surrounded by rivers that make up the navigable waterways. The white pebbles, which constitute the graveled walkways, which would have surrounded the greenhouse and other outbuildings, may have also been meaningful. As the enslaved negotiated the landscape, the combination of the white pebbles and buildings filled with iron, such as the greenhouse or the blacksmith shop, would have represented a balancing of the spiritual world. Henry John Drull explains that the white materials have the capacity to cool the heat of the red, containing and channeling the force of Ogun's forge in a powerful way. Analyzing the landscape from this perspective, the buildings lose their Euro-American sense of order and hierarchy and become something else. The blacksmith shop becomes a shrine to Ogun, the greenhouse a collection of powerful associations with strength and healing, surrounded by the balancing influence of the White River gravel. So now we can turn to the William Packer Garden in Indianapolis. So while this garden is a reconstruction, it has been investigated archaeologically and the recreation based on archaeological and historical evidence. So here we use it as a proxy for all of the formal gardens found on plantations throughout the American South, and I suppose elsewhere throughout the European colonial world. The reconstruction garden, as was the original, is comprised of a series of falling terraces, walkways, and gardening beds. So how can we interpret this garden not from a European perspective, couched in terms of power, hierarchy, and domination, as has Leone, but from an African perspective? How would these gardens appear and function to those enslaved Africans as understood through an African worldview? So here we draw heavily on the work of Chris Fennell and Leland Ferguson, where they write about African cosmologies. So crosses or crossroads, they write, are symbolic of the intersections of the spiritual and physical worlds. And these gardens almost always consisted of multiple intersecting paths. Water, and especially running water, is symbolic of the boundary between the living and the dead. Not only do these plants in these formal gardens require constant watering, but these 18th and 19th century plantations in the Chesapeake are almost exclusively found along or within sight of the rivers that fed into the bay. So not only does the Peka Garden have a significant water feature located on its lower terrace, but prior to the construction of the Naval Academy and the 20th century reconstruction of the garden that was partially designed to hide the Naval Academy, the garden would have had a view out to the Severn River. The color white, in addition to its balancing powers, is associated with the spirits of the dead, and garden paths were frequently paved with crushed oyster shell and beds lined with whole shells for drainage. The iron tools necessary for the creation and propagation of these gardens and the plants within them are associated with Ogun, who is not just only a deity of iron and fire, but also a being of transition, including birth, death, and rebirth. So when examined in this light, the Peka Garden becomes a powerful space which mediates between life and death, the physical, the spiritual, and suggests the possibility of moving between them. It seems apparent that one can re-encode these spaces using an African cognitive framework and mental templates. The question then becomes, what role did enslaved Africans and their descendants play in the creation of these spaces? As gardeners, were they able to actively and clandestinely shape these gardens to embody specific worldviews, or were they ordered to follow plans drawn up by plantation owners? As for these answers, Barbara Cerruti suggests that enslaved gardeners, especially from the Caribbean, were valued for their knowledge of tropical plants. If non-Western understandings of botany were brought into these spaces, then why isn't it also reasonable to assume that the associated belief structures and practices and packages surrounding and incorporating these plants come with them? Some have discussed African symbolism found archaeologically in the Americas. These include Cheryl LaRoche and Michael Blakey when they discuss the Sankofa, an Incan symbol shaped like a heart that describes the relationship between the past, present, and future, recovered from the African burial ground in New York City. Leland Ferguson has discussed Congo cosmograms found in the bottom of colonel-ware bowls found in rivers and borders in South Carolina. And Leone and others have found evidence of African spiritual practices in the form of bundles, caches, and cosmograms throughout the city of Annapolis. Africanist Robert Sutherland Rattray recorded 52 other Akan symbols in a 1927 ethnography, many of which are geometric and would not appear out of place cut into a parterre of English boxwood, or as the blueprint for a garden room. So rather than being a place of power, hierarchy, and domination, for the enslaved Africans and African Americans who lived alongside and frequently worked in them, these formal gardens at the very least represent a stage upon which the symbolism of West African spiritual beliefs and practices can be played out. With additional work, we hope to be able to show that they were actively able to shape these spaces for such purposes.
What do you say?
When viewed from this perspective, these alternate views of the landscape represent a subversion of the dominant narrative of landscape as power and hierarchy and recast them in a fundamentally different light. Thank you.
Good.